Sister Chris, are you well? It's good to be back. It's very good to be back. Just, it's really more fun than we ought to have, you know. I mean, we did get we did had a nice we I'd been to Hawaii once before. Gene had never been, and I don't remember the last time was. We took 2 weeks to get away, so it was very relaxing, very nice to be able to do that. Is the Second Kings references, and this is the Second Chronicles references. So tonight, Second Chronicles only, chapters 29, 30, and 31 is what we're going to cover tonight. And the section from Second Kings for next time, 18, 19, and 20, are really the history of Hezekiah. But as we look at Second Chronicles, we're going to look at his spiritual. I guess you could look at the other as being more the physical, Second Kings. Second Chronicles more the spiritual side of what he did. And there's some amazing accomplishments there. I was expressing my thanks to Brother Hamer for teaching in my absence, and I really do appreciate him. And Clint and Mark preaching while I was gone too. I appreciate that very much, allowing me to get away. I assume, last time you were talking about the fall of Israel and such a tragic ending to that northern kingdom that never did have a good king. It's just awful. But now we're moving on to get to the timelines, the graphics that we use to talk about the timelines. We moved through, of course, the United Kingdom, 40 years each for Saul, David, and Solomon. We see the kingdom split with Jeroboam taking the 10 northern tribes to form the northern kingdom, and Rehoboam taking the 2 southern tribes to form the southern kingdom of Judah. We've watched that go on. This is the time period that we're dealing with now. We've watched the northern kingdom go off, fall to the Assyrians. We talk about when the southern kingdom falls, they're going into captivity. And I think, this says captivity for the Assyrians, but it really wasn't so much captivity as I think that captivity means they were captive and then they were brought back. These guys were just kind of salted around, and they never did again as a individual nation get restored. If there was any restoration, I think, coming of the northern kingdom, it would have been when some of the folks made their way into the southern kingdom after the captivity, which we think happened a bit, but it was not a huge thing. So we're going to, from this point on, deal with Judah standing alone. And so we're doing that. That bottom slide, Hezekiah, is represented by the green portion there. We're going to go on and watch them stand alone until they do fall to the Babylonians in three different segments. There are three different waves, if you will. We're in this section. I don't know if you noticed on the last slide, but we're about 730 BC down to 680 BC in Hezekiah's reign. So that puts us in this region here where Hosea, Isaiah, Nahum, and Micah are participating. And they all seem to stop about the same time, which is interesting. I guess they stop at the fall of the northern kingdom. Let's see. The maps that I wanted to show you, the divided kingdom, we've been tracking Israel, of course, the much larger, the northern kingdom, 10 tribes, southern kingdom of Judah. That northern kingdom has fallen, and now they're kind of making inroads into the southern kingdom. And to just give you a little perspective, we're going to zoom way out and look at the Assyrian Empire. It's been telling me it's having trouble with some of these transitions here. Did it come? Okay. So you look from the Persian Gulf over to the Mediterranean, Caspian Sea, Red Sea, the early and later empires indicated in the key up there by the, what is it, salmon color, and the gray is the final extent. It's just huge kingdom. And if you can't hardly even find Judah on here, but the little green portion, the kingdom of Judah, the neighbors are so huge. I mean, this is an amazing power that was threatening them. And, that it would morph into the Babylonians by the time that this kingdom fell. But it's just, this Judah is just a little piece that is standing by God's grace, really by God's grace. And when he removes his grace, they do not stand any longer. Okay, we've got this graphic that we've been using to keep track of the kings. And remember the key to how these work. If the time bar along the center there is black, they were evil. If it was gray, they were so-so. And if it's white, that indicates that they were a good king. And so we're really grateful and surprised that we've got a nice, strong white bar for Hezekiah. And it shows their 29-year reign. And we're going to see how amazing he was overall, and especially in contrast to what had come immediately before. All right. So let's start in at 2 Chronicles chapter 29, verses 1 and 2. English Standard Version. Hezekiah began to reign when he was 25 years old, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Abijah, the daughter of Zechariah. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, according to all that David, his father, had done. You could read through it and not be totally wowed, but to say that he did all that David did. David's the standard for good. And we're going to see, as you compare him to some of the other good kings had some qualifiers. He did according to David, but he let, one of the things that many of them did, he let the high places continue. None of that for Hezekiah. We don't qualify his goodness. In real faint there, I just showed you that there's a lot that's talked about in 2 Kings that we're going to get to next time, but I just want to go right on now and get right into what it says and what it focuses on in 2 Chronicles. In the first year of his reign, in the first month, he opened the doors of the house of the Lord and repaired them. Now that makes it sound like it had been shut up, and it really had been. I mean, like scrape down the cobwebs and get in there and take the lock off the door and go in. It was, I don't know, a mausoleum. It was just kind of mothballed. And we'll read as we go on some of the violence that had been done to it. Well, here, let me just show you. Why they had to do this. It's back in 2 Chronicles 28 where it's talking about Ahaz. Ahaz gathered together the vessels of the house of God, cut in pieces the vessels of the house of God. That you know, when you do something like that, you're not even interested in the shape that it's in. You're interested in it for scrap. It just kind of, we'll cut it up and make some other use of it. He shut up the doors of the house of the Lord. So this is why Hezekiah needs to open them. They were like, nailed shut. I don't know the exact method, but they were shut. And the people weren't going in there. He made altars in every corner of Jerusalem, in every city of Judah. He made high places to make offerings to other gods, provoking to anger the Lord, the God of his fathers. So this is the scenario into which Hezekiah comes. And at age 25, he says, we're going to fix that. And so that's when he opens up the temple. And what do you do? Well, go ahead, Mark.
So it's interesting. So his father Ahaz was terribly wicked, even offering his sons burned sacrifices, human sacrifices to these idols. Terrible king, terrible example. And then Hezekiah comes along, the son, and in the very first month of his 29-year reign, he opens the Lord's house. He goes back and opens the temple and cleanses it. So right at the beginning, others, it took a few years to kind of catch on to what was going on. And granted, he was 25 years old, but it's just really remarkable that you see that contrast between father and son. It's just crazy. Where did he get this from? How is it that he understood these things and his father didn't?
And to look to an answer for that, maybe in verse number 1, where it tells us who his mother is. And it tells us that she was the daughter of Zechariah. And Zechariah was a good guy. He was strong. And so maybe it came through that. Maybe it was, even though dad's doing all that, mom says, you know how to do better than that. But yeah, he did not hesitate. Hezekiah didn't hesitate. And say that 3 times fast.
I think you're absolutely right there with the mother. I think we have a clue as well in verse 10, and I know we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, go ahead.
It is in my heart to make a covenant with the Lord God of Israel, that his burning anger may turn away from us. I think not only did he probably have a good influence, right, but he saw the peril that was befalling the people, and in his heart he made the connection that, look, this is happening because we've turned from God. There's only one thing to do, and that's turn back to God. And it says it was in his heart.
Yeah. It's a strong and wonderful statement to say that it was in his heart. And so it got in. And we talked about this last time about the jump from father to son to son to son to son. You keep going on, and it goes good, evil, good, evil, good, evil. And seemingly no effect. I mean, you can't really establish a law. A good father has a bad son, a good father has a good son. It changes. And so we talk about faith of our fathers sometimes, and he just took it to heart to say this, we're not going to let that stand on my watch. We're going to serve the Lord. So he makes this great decision. And what do? I was really impressed by his approach. In verse 4, he brought in the priests. So the priests are the ones who are supposed to be closest to God. But they've been displaced, or they've even been shunned. I don't know if they're persona non grata because of all the ungodliness of Ahaz, but where are they? He finds them, and he assembled them in the square of the east and said to them, "Hear me, Levites," which I think kind of implies that the Levites were there too, but all priests are Levites, not all Levites are priests. He addresses them there as Levites. Consecrate yourselves. Consecrate yourselves and consecrate the house of the Lord, the God of your fathers. Carry out the filth from the holy place. For our fathers have been unfaithful, have done what is evil in the sight of the Lord our God. They have forsaken him, have turned away their faces from the habitation of the Lord, and turned their backs. They shut the doors of the vestibule and put out the lamps, that have not burned incense or offered burnt offerings in the place of the God in the holy place to the God of Israel. That's why the wrath of the Lord came on Judah and Jerusalem. He's made them an object of horror, of astonishment, of hissing, as you see with your own eyes. For behold, our fathers have fallen by the sword, and our sons and our daughters and our wives are in captivity for this. He calls it captivity there too. And I think he's showing a real connection to the northern kingdom that has fallen, and I think that takes a big heart to do that, to associate with somebody that's befallen a tragedy. As we already read in verse 10, it's in my heart to make a covenant with the Lord, the God of Israel, in order that his fierce anger may turn away from us. My sons, do not now be negligent, for the Lord has chosen you to stand in his presence, to minister to him, and to be his ministers and make offerings to him. So he confesses what's in his heart, and he tries to enlist the priests to get it in their heart, to make that same commitment. And he invites them to consecrate themselves. If you go back to Exodus chapter 29, you can read about the process of the consecration of the priests. And it's the whole chapter, really. Chapter 29. It's pretty involved. And it wasn't the kind of thing where, you go and wash and you come away and you're consecrated. It took a while for it to happen. It mentions a period of 7 days for this to happen. And, it could have been longer. I think if you read it, you do this and then 7 days and maybe this in 7 days. So take away, did that go back to, yeah, it did. Take away from this that consecration was not immediate. That's going to come up as we go through the narrative. You can also go to Exodus 40, and now it's just a couple of verses. Toward the end of the book of Exodus, they're making everything according to the pattern that's going to be their platform for worshiping for the next few hundred years. When that's all done, it has to be consecrated. And so when you think of consecration, what do you think of? Purifying and setting apart, dedicating. I think all of those are in there, the idea of consecration. You're going to set this apart to a special purpose. And so that's what he's doing here. He's calling them to do this to themselves, and he's calling them to do this to the house of the Lord. So, again, you could read Exodus 29 and see how the priests do it to themselves. But what do you do with the house of the Lord? Well, one part of it he already talked about in the last part of verse 5. Carry out the filth from the holy place. The scriptures, I have a tactful, I guess you could say, generally, way to refer to sinful behavior. The Apostle Paul in one place said it is not even appropriate for us to talk about the things that they do. And so sometimes they'll just say it like that and they don't list everything. So they'll tell us exactly what the filth was that was in the place. But you get the idea, just using that word filth, that has a terrible connotation. There was some awful stuff in there. So the first part is you got to get that out. And you got to get rid of that. And then, once it's cleansed, you can kind of purify it, go through the ceremony with whatever sprinkling and anointing and washing, probably washing first and then sprinkling and anointing, and you got it back. So that's the process that he calls them to. And when the scriptures, like in verse 12 and following, list all the names of the folks involved, that just makes it more real for us. We know it isn't just some sort of made-up thing, and that we're talking about some priest somewhere. These are the guys. These are the guys that were affected by this, and they're the ones that responded. In verse 15, they gathered their brothers, and they consecrated themselves. And they went as the king had commanded by the words of the Lord to cleanse the house of the Lord. So in verse 16, they went in, they brought out all the uncleanness that they found. Again, not telling us specifics, you just leave that to your imagination, what they found in there, bringing it out into the court of the house of the Lord, and the Levites took it, carried it out to the brook Kindred, and I don't know that it mentions here that they just had a big fire, but I mean, they basically took it to the dump, and I don't know whether they burned it or not. They just got rid of it. And in verse 17, they began to consecrate on the first day of the month, and on the 8th day of the month, they came to the vestibule of the Lord. Then for 8 days they consecrated the house of the Lord, and on the 16th day of the first month they finished. And then they went to the king in verse 18, and they said, "We have cleansed all the house of the Lord, and the altar of burnt offering and all its utensils, and the table for the showbread and all its utensils, all the utensils that King Ahaz discarded in his reign when he was faithless. And we've made ready and consecrated, and behold, they're before the altar of the Lord." So they did it. They responded. And they did what they were called to do. Good first step, starting with the priest in the house of the Lord. Questions, comments?
So wait, so the showbread is like that middle table, right?
Right, in the holy place.
Jeff, you think it could have changed because what happened? Excuse me. What happened to the Northern Kingdom? You see what happened when they never worshiped God correctly, and he swallowed enough. People were like, "Oh, they got punished because and we doing what Israel. We about to change."
Yeah,
I think that could have made the change too. Thinking about
yeah.
what for the Northern Kingdom.
Yeah, it was part of his process, right? That was in like verse 8 or so. In verse 7, they shut the doors of the vestibule, put out the lamps, they've done all those things. Therefore, because of that, the wrath of the Lord came on Judah and Jerusalem and all of that. So yeah, he made the connection, and he said, not on my watch. We're not going to do that same thing. We're not going to make that same error. Absolutely. Well, where do you go from there? If you've got the temple prepared, then it's time to use it again. So we've got it cleaned out, it's ready to go. We've got the priests cleaned up and consecrated and ready to go. So let's worship. Let's get worship reestablished. Hezekiah the king rose early, gathered the officials of the city. So notice this is a larger group now. He dealt first with the priests and some Levites and the house of the Lord. Now it's out to the city. He's got the city, and he starts to bring in the process, or get the process going, of worship again, which involves bulls and rams and lambs and goats, and they're just doing all sorts of stuff. And, we've never sacrificed anything. We have little cups of blood. I can't imagine how the blood would have been running when they were doing this. It would have just been, it does use the word slaughter in here, but it would affect you, I think. It should affect you to see all of these things dying and all these lives offered as substitutes.
Just real quick, as you think about that, the sacrifice of Christ was meant to be a parallel to the sacrifices like the ones that we're seeing here.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of times in the church, and I mean that in the Church of Christ and typically, when you see pictures, it's of a cleaned up Christ, you know, who's laying dead on the cross, but his body is, you know, unmutilated, if you will. When you think about scourging, and I've talked about this a few times, and what it meant, when you understand what the slaughter looked like, and as you just said, I mean, there's blood running all over the ground, there's blood on the altar, there's blood everywhere, you know, and then you talk about Jesus being the sacrifice for all the sins, and then you really understand that that was also, you know, in Hebrews it said, no covenant is made without the sprinkling of blood, and Jesus' blood was shed as well.
That's right.
You think about, you know, Jesus' sacrifice being a gory thing. And this illustration brings that into perspective, I think. It helps us understand that, you know, Jesus really did suffer.
Yeah.
And the people understood that. When the people at the time heard about Jesus being offered for sacrifice, I don't think they had the sanitized object in mind. They probably had a much more
Yeah.
gruesome
Gruesome
picture in mind.
word.
And rightly so, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. So notice this is the folks in Jerusalem that have been called to do this, the city. But the purpose of these, the last part of verse 24, the king commanded that the burnt offering and the sin offering should be made for all Israel. So he's extending the effect of this out to the whole country. So he's really thinking about everybody. But he started small within his own heart, then the heart of the priests, now the city, and we're rippling out. I came upon this verse, and I think this is one of the most important passages when it comes to establishing the authority for mechanical instruments in the Old Testament. You know, we don't use, I think it's one of the most obvious things to our visitors who have any experience with Christian worship when they come in and they just don't see an organ, they don't see a piano, they don't see anything. Sometimes I'll tell them there's good news and bad news. The good news is we have a choir. The bad news is you're it. And so start singing, But there's no mechanical instrument. And sometimes I think to justify that, we say, well, it's not authorized. But it sure was in the Old Testament. And this is the best summary verse I can find for how it was authorized in the Old Testament. It says, as they're getting ready to offer here, he stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals, harps, and lyres. Where did those things come from? According to the commandment of David. All right, so David was the one who started that. It doesn't seem like there was much instrumental music going on before David. He was the psalmist of Israel, and he was the one that established this. And of Gad the king's seer and Nathan the prophet. So that trio is the group that is behind the use of mechanical instruments of worship. But notice what it goes on to say. For the commandment was from the Lord through his prophets. So David did not overstep there. That really was authorized for them for that period of time to use mechanical instruments in the temple. And so you need to understand that, because if you ever made the claim that mechanical instruments were never authorized, somebody that knows this verse is going to contradict you, and you'll be in a tough spot. So when we talk about mechanical instruments, we just say they're not authorized in the New Testament. They definitely were in the Old. So they've got this group together, and evidently they've got a choir too. Verse 28, the whole assembly worshiped, the singers sang. It sounds like they've got a choir. So yeah, you wonder where other folks get this. Where do they get the idea for mechanical instruments and for a choir? Well, it is an Old Testament idea. A lot of the things that our Catholic friends do are from the Old Testament. The idea of dressing up a priest, having a priest, dressing him up, that's an Old Testament idea. People bring these things from the Old Testament and apply them incorrectly.
Jeff, I think if, like you said, the two covenant, the Old Testament, there's more about works, earthly things. I mean, Jesus in John 4:24, worship God, spirit of truth, right? It's more spiritual. It's from
Yeah.
the heart. Worship is different than the Old Testament. The Old Testament, you can, like, there's a curse against you, and you try to do everything you can to keep the law, right? But
Right.
you couldn't because you did one thing. But when Jesus came and everything, it's all about the spirit, your heart, your mind. How God looks at your heart. He don't look at the external thing they did in the Old Testament.
Mhm.
The individual.
Mm-hmm.
They have a temple and everything, and we're the temple and stuff now. So people be trying to bring things in the Old Testament. Like I was saying Sunday morning, they're two different laws, right? You trying to bring Jesus, have the Old Testament, and bring Jesus back to the Old Testament.
Yeah.
You can't have Jesus and bring the Old Testament to Jesus, so they don't go together. So that's separate the two.
That's right. That's right. Clint?
I fully agree with Hamer, of course. The other piece, and you've done this before, and I've seen it before too, the other piece is as you understand this, you say, okay, well, God specifically authorized it, in fact, commanded it in the Old Testament. But there's a parallel that you can do with other things God specifically commanded in the Old Testament, like the slaughter of bulls and goats that we just talked about. And so if you follow through with that logic, you would say, well, why aren't we slaughtering bulls and goats today? And the answer is, well, because Jesus was that sacrifice. So it's to the New Testament implemented something different.
That's right.
And so when you kind of go through that parallel study, you can see that, well, they did this in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, we're told that we're supposed to be making the melodies and that we're supposed to be singing songs of praise to God. So when you go through sort of the parallel by parallel study, you can get a better understanding of why it was not just okay but commanded then, but now we do it differently. It's not the only thing. It's not the only case that parallel applies to. That's
right. That's right. And that's the way you have to approach it to have it understood, I think, is to do that. To illustrate succinctly what you were saying about he's calling us to a different level, I think just the first part of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, you've heard that it was said, but I tell you. And all that stuff that they had heard was coming from the law. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, but I say, you've heard it said, you shall divorce your wife except for adultery, but I say. And so he's calling us to a higher standard in all of these areas, and that's just shows you where he was headed with this. He always wanted their hearts, always wanted our hearts. But, yeah. Sean?
I learned recently, using that argument is very true, but I didn't have a lot of success in speaking to people because you have to get to another basis. But I learned recently that there's an actual direct parallel in how David used instruments in the same way in how he used them. And when he used instruments, they were authorized and they were commanded up until they had to do the sin sacrifice. When they gave the sin sacrifice, God commanded them to use their voices only, which is an exact parallel to how we do it today. Jesus was our sin sacrifice, therefore there is no more instruments. And I never could explain it other than just the difference between the two laws were changed. But in fact, he did the same thing with them as he does with us. The only difference is our sin sacrifice is completely gone.
Right. Yeah.
And so David never used it beyond that.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Good parallel. So that worship is going on. Hezekiah comments on this in verse 31. You have now consecrated yourselves to the Lord. Come near, bring sacrifices and thank offerings to the house of the Lord. And they brought them, and there's a list of all sorts of things. It created a problem in verse 34. The priests were too few and could not flay all the burnt offerings. So until other priests had consecrated themselves, their brothers the Levites helped them until the work was finished. For the Levites were more upright in heart than the priests in consecrating themselves. And it goes on to say, besides the great number of burnt offerings, there was the fat of the peace offerings, there was the drink offerings, the burnt offerings. Thus the servants of the house of the Lord was restored. And Hezekiah and all the people rejoiced because God had provided for the people, for the thing came about suddenly. So it was kind of sounds like a surprise, or just it gained some momentum. It went a little faster than he thought it would, and that was why we hadn't had all the priests consecrated yet. It takes time, and this evidently, you get the impression that some of the priests just dawdled and didn't get right on it, didn't get onto the process, and so they were needed at this point. They weren't there, but we had all the sacrifices, so the Levites who had prepared themselves kind of stepped up. And it's interesting to see there are some exceptions in this area, some good exceptions. This was one. We need help. All right, we'll use the Levites. It seems like it's pleasing to God. They got the spirit of the law right there. Mark? No? Well, so now what do? Well, you've got everything prepared. You've got worship going. It's time to do the Passover. And so Hezekiah restores the Passover in chapter 30. And notice the scope here of this. Hezekiah said to all Israel and Judah. There were still some folks that hadn't been carted away up in the northern kingdom. What you saw what in chapter 17 of 2 Kings, what had happened. They took select people out of Samaria, and then they salted them over throughout the rest of that big map of Assyria, and they took people from Assyria and they brought them in. So it was a big shuffle of folks. There were still some folks up north that would have been technically Israelites. He calls them, and I think this is magnanimous of him to reach out to these folks who have been through such a terrible thing in the Assyrians conquering them. It mentions Ephraim and Manasseh especially here. Come to the house of the Lord at Jerusalem to keep the Passover of the Lord, the God of Israel. And so it was also a timing problem. They were going to do it in the second month. If you go back and see, there was a provision under the law. If someone wasn't ready because of being ceremonially unclean when the first Passover came around, you could do it later. You could do it a month later. And it looks like the whole population is taking advantage of that second or that exception clause because of the timing of this thing. So they did that from Beersheba to Dan, and that's a widespread. We're talking about the whole area of Israel at that time. And he incites them, encourages them. In verse 7, do not be like your fathers and your brothers. He's calling for renewal and people to come back to the Lord. A wonderful thing, a wonderful leader here. Don't be stiff-necked. Come back. So verse 10, the couriers take this all around. And some came. Some came, and there was a response to this. Very great assembly in verse 13. And now, all of those folks that have come to take part in this Passover become a kind of cleanup committee to go after other places that had been defiled by what Ahaz had done. Remember, it said he had set up altars all over the place. So in verse 14, they set to work and removed the altars that were in Jerusalem and all the altars for burning incense. They took them away and threw them into the brook Kidron. So again, they're doing that. They slaughter the Passover, and they celebrate that the right way. The consecration caught some in verse 17. There were lots who wanted to take part that hadn't consecrated themselves. The majority, it says, had not cleansed themselves. But I guess they just kind of said, well, we'll just kind of overlook that. And may the good Lord pardon everyone, the last part of verse 18. We couldn't get you all cleaned up in time. Maybe that'll be okay. And I love the spirit of this. He's trying. He's trying to do the best he can, but this is going faster than is manageable, almost. It catches on. It's a contagious thing. In verse 21, the people of Israel who were present at Jerusalem kept the Feast of Unleavened Bread 7 days with great gladness. And they praised the Lord every day, singing with all their might to the Lord. And Hezekiah spoke encouragingly to all the Levites who showed good skill. The whole assembly agreed together to keep the feast for another 7 days. So they kept it for another 7 days with gladness. And Hezekiah was providing what they needed for this: bulls, sheep, amazing numbers. More consecration of priests, verse 24. Everybody came out. Sojourners came out of the land. Sojourners who lived in Judah rejoiced. There was great joy in Jerusalem. For since the time of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, there had been nothing like this in Jerusalem. This is what Hezekiah does. And the priests and the Levites arose, blessed the people, their voice was heard, their prayer came up to his holy habitation in heaven. I wanted you to see this as we get to the end of our time. He goes on in chapter 31, and he destroys more cleanup. And now this is reaching to the whole land. They went out to the cities now. And these folks that have worshiped go home charged up, and they're on the lookout for any idolatrous paraphernalia that they find. And they went out to the cities of Judah. They broke in pieces the pillars, cut down the Asherim, broke down the high places and the altars throughout all Judah and Benjamin, and in Ephraim and Manasseh, until they had destroyed them all. This is huge, dear ones. This is pervasive now. This is, as far as they still had some control, this was being done. And let me just summarize so we don't miss the import of this. First of all, the order of his reformation. In his own heart, he reestablished a covenant with God. He established a covenant with God. He called the priests to reestablish themselves, to consecrate themselves, and to consecrate the temple as well. And then, it keeps wanting to go back to that. I don't know why. Then they get that taken care of. They celebrate the Passover with everybody they could invite to it. That gets done. And then, let's see. Then it's all Israel, and then as all Israel is assembled and they go home, they keep getting everything straight as they go home. This is a brilliant and highly effective way to get the country back on track, and that's what he does. And let me just show you in comparison some of the good kings before. I list Solomon as good. He was good for a while. But Asa, Jehoshaphat, Jehoash, Amaziah, Azariah, good kings in Judah. But as you look at the summaries of their time, it'll say they did well with some qualification or reservation. Listen to this. Only the people sacrificed in the high places of Solomon. And for Asa, the high places weren't removed. Jehoshaphat, nevertheless, the high places were not taken away. Jehoash, the high places were not taken away. So every one of them, it says those high places weren't taken away until we get to Hezekiah. And when we see what Hezekiah did, finally, the high places are taken away. And Hezekiah's commendation from the Holy Spirit here is without qualification. We don't find that clause that the high places were not taken away. They were taken away. He got Israel back on track, Judah back on track. And it's an amazing and it's a wonderful thing. And so we want to think about that. One of the things we see also in here, you can go on through and read chapter 31. We'll talk about this next time, but one of the things he made was a tunnel. I guess we will talk about that next time. I hear the folks coming. So we've just started into Hezekiah focusing on the spiritual restoration that he accomplished, which was major. There's a lot more to talk about. So we'll be in 2 Kings 18, 19, and 20 a week from tonight, Lord willing, as we continue with this. So all right, that's what we've got for tonight, and we'll take a brief break till the folks get up from downstairs. How we doing? Hi, Lexi. Hey, Ryan. I'll index from back here, I guess. I don't know why this is having a challenge tonight.
Stick the iPad up there and see if that works. So they use the past couple days, Sundays, because we didn't have another tablet.
Okay, do you want to try to navigate with that? Yeah. Okay, all right. I'll be back here as a fail-safe if it falls apart. Yeah.
It doesn't, if you don't scroll it down.
Right.
I'll try to jump back up. So maybe just make it for one song, but not for the first song between.
Yep. I'll do it.
Yeah, I was looking back here, I couldn't figure out why any reason.
It was definitely in the talking back and forth, and I don't know if I'm on the wrong network or something. Hey, Jeff. Good. You okay?
Yeah, how are you?
Good. I see you. It looks like that because it's got a setting on there for it to look that way. There we go.
Good evening. So we'll go ahead and get started for the singing and the short talk this evening. First song will be number 10. The law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. statutes of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. More to be desired are they than gold, yea, than much fine gold. Sweeter also than honey and the honeycomb. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. More to be desired are they than gold, yea, than much fine gold. Sweeter also than honey and the honeycomb.
If you'd like to turn to 2 Kings chapter 6, plan to read from 2 Kings chapter 6 in just a moment. Tim, what is the invitation song?
It's 837.
837, if you want to mark, I guess it'll be on the board there for you, but I've got to mark it, so give me just a second if you could. 837, you said, right?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. So, I've been thinking this last week. I mentioned to Greg that saw some pictures of the people of Ukraine, and it was interesting to me to see people and a culture and a society that were so much like us in so many different ways. And, you know, it's easy. You look at different people of different European nations, and, you know, their culture's different, they look different, and not that looking different is that big a deal, but it just, I think, for me, I just was really associating with the people of Ukraine in my mind and my heart more, just because their society seems so similar to ours. They're a very modern society, and they're, you know, I think I mentioned to Greg that some of the people that I'd seen in the pictures, if you saw them at the mall, you wouldn't think anything of it. They're a lot like us. And to be invaded by another nation and to have that kind of devastation ongoing, and the last news reports that I saw today, and I'm not sure which city, I didn't read the report, but I just saw the headlines that one of the major cities in Ukraine was completely surrounded. I don't think it was Kyiv yet, but perhaps it was. I guess they've been saying Kyiv has been surrounded for several days now. But the devastation and the destruction is just hard to even comprehend. And again, for me, it becomes almost personal because of the nature of the culture and the people and so on, and their efforts to withstand the invasion and the onslaught. And I was thinking about 2 Kings chapter 6. I was thinking about something that happens here. You know, if you go back a couple of chapters in 2 Kings, you kind of have the introduction here of Elisha, and there's kind of a recounting of the amazing miracles that Elisha performed to, testify of his witness for God, that he was a prophet. He was not just a prophet, he was a great prophet, performing amazing miracles. In chapter 5, of course, we have the account of Naaman, who was a leper, and Elisha cured him of his leprosy through the power that was given to him by God. And then in chapter 6, we start to see problems with the Assyrians.
There's the axe that one of the prophets loses, the axe head, and it flies off while he's chopping wood, and Elisha makes it float, another great miracle. And then I want to pick up reading here in chapter 8, where we have this situation. Aram is basically, as I understand it, this is Syria, the nation of Syria. So Aram and Syria apparently are the same thing. Not Assyria, like we were studying in class this evening, but Syria. Now the king of Aram, this is chapter 8, 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 8, sorry. Now the king of Aram was warring against Israel.